This video will discuss some very important information about plagiarism. I'm not just going to define plagiarism and talk about the consequences, although we'll spend a few moments talking about that too, but we'll also discuss some perfectly innocent mistakes that college freshmen sometimes make when using other people's words and ideas in their writing. What I'll cover in this video is based on my experiences talking with students about plagiarism and just over a decade of teaching writing to college students. Over that time, I've learned a lot about what leads students to plagiarize, all or part of a paper. Sometimes these reasons have to do with misunderstandings about expectations, sometimes it's a matter of running short of time to complete an assignment, and sometimes it's a misunderstanding about all of the things that constitute plagiarism. Plagiarism is confusing because it's not really just one thing. The term plagiarism refers to a lot of different actions, but all of these actions are related to something larger and much more important, which we'll talk about in a moment. I assign students to watch this video early in the semester and to then complete a short assignment after watching it. If you're a student in my class, you'll be responsible for knowing the information I cover here. If you're unclear about anything discussed in this video, contact me as soon as possible. We'll start out with a very simple definition of what plagiarism is: the practice of taking someone else's work or ideas and passing them off as one's own. I want to point out here that plagiarism also includes using someone else's ideas in your writing, and you may already be thinking of a problem that presents. How can someone own an idea? Is any idea really original? Hold that thought. We'll talk about that more in a few moments. We have to get one thing out of the way at the beginning of this video. Plagiarism is cheating, even if you don't mean to do it. It's against college policy at TCC and at any other college or university anywhere. As a college student, it's your responsibility to know what plagiarism is and to avoid it, and that's what this video is all about. We're going to do this in 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about why plagiarism is such a big deal. We'll talk about the very serious penalties on those who commit plagiarism, but more importantly, we'll talk about why plagiarism is taken so seriously. Second, we're going to go through exactly what constitutes plagiarism, and we'll be talking about more than just downloading an essay off the internet. It's way more complicated than that. Finally, we'll talk about situations where a student can commit plagiarism and get in serious trouble for it without even knowing they've done anything wrong. That really does happen, and we'll talk about how to avoid it. So here's the first part: why plagiarism could be thought of as the single biggest cardinal academic sin, just about the worst thing you can do as a student. And the first thing to know is that plagiarism really is literally stealing, and I mean that in the legal sense. Anytime someone writes something or invents something, an essay, a song, a line of computer code, that person has created what's known as intellectual property. And to a certain degree, the law treats intellectual property just like physical property. So if you pick up someone else's words or ideas and you take them somewhere else and say, "This is mine," it's the same thing as taking someone's phone or watch or bicycle and putting it in a different place and saying, "This is mine." Here's a more formal definition of intellectual property: a product of the intellect that has commercial value, including copyrighted property such as literary or artistic works, and ideational property, meaning it's an idea someone had, such as patents, business methods, or industrial processes. So essentially, if you write something or create something, whether it's a piece of literature, a new software, or a new way of doing something, you own that thing. Now you might be saying, wait, that's a little far-fetched. How can anyone own an idea? And why does anyone care? Aren't ideas everywhere all the time? There's a reason why intellectual property rights are taken so seriously, and that reason is the answer to so many other puzzling things in life, and that answer is money. When someone writes or invents something new, that person has the right to charge money to anyone who wants to look at, read, or use the intellectual property in any way. The sale of intellectual property is the reason why countless companies exist and make money and hire employees. According to a report published by the United States Senate, intellectual property is tied to 30% of the U.S. economy. What that represents, quite simply, is jobs. The same report says that 20% of all jobs in the U.S. are involved in producing intellectual property. And it also says that workers who produce intellectual property are among the best educated and highest paid in the country. So if you want a successful career, you might want to think along the lines of doing something where you're producing intellectual property. Here are just a scattering of the jobs focused on producing intellectual property. Coders produce computer code that runs software which people buy and download from places like Apple's App Store. Movie producers make films that people buy through Netflix or Amazon, or maybe even by going to a movie theater, which some of us still do. And engineers make designs for everything from self-driving cars to the new rocket ships that are supposed to take humans to Mars in a few more decades. And we could probably come up with thousands of other job titles that are mainly responsible for producing intellectual property. It's a really huge part of the workforce. And what all of this has to do with plagiarism is that's what plagiarism policies are designed to teach. Part of what a college education is supposed to do is to teach students to think creatively and independently, to produce their own work so they'll go out and do that in their real working lives, to create new inventions and designs that will make life better and easier for everyone. And it's worth saying that intellectual property protections are pretty extensive. This is just a partial list of things that are protected under intellectual property law, things you could claim ownership of if you created them. The first couple aren't too surprising. We all know that someone has ownership over a book they write or a song they produce. That's why it's illegal to download music online without paying for it. But look at this. People can even claim ownership over pantomimes. You know, the guy in the box. Somebody owns that, theoretically. So it just goes to show that intellectual property rights extend into lots of different areas. And plagiarism policies exist to get you used to working in an environment where you have to be really, really careful not to steal someone else's work, even if it's tempting to do so, and even if you didn't mean to do it. So to sum up, plagiarism policies teach respect for intellectual property in the workplace, the severity of penalties for claiming someone else's intellectual property as your own, and perhaps most importantly, how to avoid violating the intellectual property rights of others. Now we'll talk about some of the more specific things to know about plagiarism, including what exactly is considered plagiarism, beyond just the obvious practice of downloading a paper from online. We'll also talk about penalties for committing plagiarism. In my experience, a lot of students commit plagiarism because they run short of time to complete an assignment, and they reason that it's unlikely they'll be discovered. It's important to know that in most college classes these days, students submit their papers through an online system, such as Canvas, which is what we use at TCC. Papers that are submitted through Canvas are scanned by special software that identifies plagiarism. TCC uses a product called Turnitin.com, which compares the assignment you submit to documents all over the internet. The software can identify even a few words taken from some other source. One way that someone might be tempted to get around Turnitin.com software is to use a so-called essay writing service. These services claim to sell original papers written specifically for your assignment, but it's a pretty well-known fact that what these services really do is sell the same papers over and over again, and these papers are picked right up by Turnitin.com and other similar software products. Another thing that's considered plagiarism, and this is something that some people aren't aware of, is what's known as a double submission. This means turning in the same paper in different classes. Turnitin.com will also identify this as a plagiarized paper, even though it's one that you wrote, and the penalties will be the same as if you copied someone else's work. It's expected that the work you do for each and every class will be new, different, and unique. The point of taking different classes is to learn something new in each class you take, and writing papers is part of what teaches you what you need to know. Probably the most common form of plagiarism I see is when a student copies and pastes portions of several different articles into an essay. Anytime you use someone else's words or ideas in your writing, you have to do several different things to give credit to those sources. And exactly how to do that is something I go into in several other videos. If you're a student in one of my classes, we'll cover this in great detail. Here, I'll show you an example of what you definitely cannot do, and exactly what happens if you do. Let's say my former student, Flo Schmo, has to write a paper about Florida's campus carry legislation, which is something lots of college students in Florida are talking about these days. Flo has waited until the last minute to do the assignment, and even though she thinks of herself as a good person who doesn't cheat, she's desperate to keep her grades up. So she goes to Google and finds some articles on the topic. She finds one that sounds good on the Orlando Sentinel's website, and then she copies a paragraph and pastes it into her paper. Then she adds a sentence of her own to try to make it sound a little bit more like an essay than a newspaper article. Then she finds another article from the Miami Herald, and she takes a paragraph from there and pastes that into her paper. And then she takes something from a Tampa Bay Times article and copies that, and takes a little more from the Orlando Sentinel. She formats her paper nicely so it looks and sounds like an essay, and submits it to Canvas. Within a few minutes, this icon pops up beside the assignment link. That's the Turnitin.com icon, and it's color-coded. Yellow and red means that significant portions of the paper were plagiarized. If Flo clicks on the icon, a report will pop up that identifies how much of the paper she plagiarized, and exactly where she got the information. This is exactly the same thing Flo's professor will see when he goes to grade her on the assignment. And when he does, he then has an obligation to file a report with the Office of Student Conduct. This is the office charged with enforcing the policy set forth in the TCC Student Handbook, which has an extensive section on academic dishonesty and plagiarism. Faculty members are required to submit an incident report anytime a student is found to have plagiarized a paper. It's a simple online form, and faculty only need to check a box to say that a student violated the policy on academic dishonesty. For a student, the process is lengthy and difficult and takes a great deal of time to resolve. The Office of Student Conduct will conduct a hearing and impose some form of sanction, which could include administratively withdrawing the students from the class or even from all classes. In almost all cases, the student will also earn an F on the assignment in question. Suffice it to say, plagiarism is taken very seriously by colleges and universities. So if you're having difficulty completing an assignment or completing it by the deadline, it's best to have a conversation with your professor. This will save you a lot of trouble in the end. The final thing we'll talk about is how plagiarism can sometimes be more complicated than it sounds. I've encountered a lot of students over the years who are terrified about being accused of plagiarism, and for good reason. It's something we rarely discuss in composition courses, but it's something you're supposed to avoid at all costs. So let's talk about some of the ways in which plagiarism can be more complicated than it might sound. We'll begin by looking at some of the really draconian plagiarism policies that exist at colleges and universities. I think these policies and similar messages are where some of the anxiety comes from. Here's one from the University of California at Davis. It's notable for how short it is. It simply tells students to know what plagiarism is and avoid it. So it just puts the responsibility on the student. Notice that it says you have to cite a source when you use the words or ideas of any other person. And that brings up a problem. It's pretty clear if or not you're using someone else's words. But someone else's ideas? Ideas are everywhere, aren't they? Does someone own every idea that's ever been thought of? And how do you know if someone else has ever had the same idea as you? In a few moments, I'll give you something you can use to at least partly resolve these questions and cite sources appropriately. Then the policy concludes by telling students if they're confused, they should talk to an instructor. But how do you know if you're confused? Oftentimes when I'm confused, I have no idea I'm confused. That's what makes me confused in the first place. TCC's policy is maybe a little more helpful. It does specifically mention the use of paraphrase and quotation, skills we'll be talking about later in the semester if you're in my class, and it references the concept of giving full and clear acknowledgement for a source, which is something I spend a lot of time talking about. Here's one idea for thinking through if you need to cite ideas or information. I call it the average person standard. Ask yourself, would the average person know this information off the top of her or his head? If the answer is no, then cite a source for it. A lot of times we hear or read things in the news, in class, or just in conversations with the people around us, and we want to use that information in a paper. The problem is that we probably don't remember exactly where the information came from. The best thing to do in that situation is to find a source for the information and cite that source. You might also want to think about having a trusted friend, relative, peer, tutor, or professor look over a paper and try to find anything that they think should be cited. The more feedback you get, the better. By getting feedback, you'll begin to see the patterns and the logic behind what needs to be cited and what doesn't. The best rule of thumb to keep in mind is, when in doubt, cite. Find a source for the information you use and cite it. If you do this, you should be safe from any accusation of plagiarism. That concludes this video on understanding plagiarism.